Hello guys, those who follow Syriana Analysis, they know that I covered the Syrian war. I showed you the reasons why regional and international powers tried to overthrow the government in Syria, and later I also addressed when Trump ended the CIA-covered operation in Syria, Timber Sycamore, and he replaced it with unilateral coercive measures and draconian sanctions against the country in order to stop Syria from reconstructing and healing. Now, every time Syria tries to make deals with other countries, governments, or even non-state actors, we will see that lots of Western officials, they come to the media and they warn and threaten those countries who try to make deals with Syria. And also, not only the countries, but also journalists, those who call themselves journalists, they jump the wagon and they try to open holes in any attempt Syria is making to, as I mentioned, to recover and reconstruct. Now, what's happening recently, and I will share this article with you, Syria has made a deal with China, and this deal is about Syria to receive Chinese communications equipment in aid. This is published by an official Chinese media outlet, and the agreement was on the 28th of July this month. Syria is set to receive communications equipment from China as part of an ongoing aid to the war-torn country, according to a deal signed at an exchange of notes ceremony held in Damascus on Wednesday. The aid aims to improve local network infrastructure, so it specifies what the use of this communications equipment, especially in those areas hit hard during the Syrian crisis. Now, one of the countries apparently that is not happy with this deal is Israel, and they published, of course, it's not that Israel published this article, but this article, New Chinese Aid for Syria, sets off alarms in Israel. But when we go to the author, his name is Ari Egozi, and we see who is this guy, we will realize that Ari was born in Israel and he served in the Israeli forces. He graduated from Tel Aviv University with a degree in political science and journalism, and later he worked as a defense correspondent for Israel's largest daily newspaper, Yedaot Ahronot, and now he is the editor-in-chief of the Israeli Homeland Security website, IHLS. So when we dive into the article, we will see that he interviewed lots of security officials. Some of them are named, others are not. And he's basically representing the official line of Israel through this article that I want to share with you because we want to discuss how also Israel thinks of Syria, right? And lots of people, they miss the main point of the Syrian war, that is, of course, Syria represents a threat to the American interests in the Middle East, but it's not into extent that Syria can foil projects, right? Big grand projects of the United States. But Syria was more or less a threat to Israel. And through its vital support to armed groups, whether it's in Lebanon or in Palestine, who were resisting the occupation forces, Syria posed a threat on Israel. So Israel wanted to get rid of the Syrian government and destroy the army. And one of the main things that a lot of people also miss, the first thing that the so-called rebels did in Syria, they attacked and destroyed the air defenses of Syria. And now we can see in 2022 who benefited from this. I mean, even if you are very anti-Assad and you hate the Syrian army and you're a rebel and you want to overthrow the government, why would you destroy the air defenses? What are the uses of the air defense systems against rebels who don't have warplanes, right? Fighter jets. Anyways, so the article starts by saying, a recent announcement of Chinese aid for Syria is setting off alarm bells in Israeli security circles. So he mentions the agreement, and it's a basic that he mentions that during the July 20th ceremony held in Damascus, an announcement was made that Syria will receive advanced communications equipment from China. And according to the official announcement, the aid aims to improve local network infrastructure, especially in those areas hit hard during the Syrian crisis in 2011. Now, he goes to the relations between China and Israel, and he mentions saying relations between Israel and China are cordial, if somewhat strained in recent years by U.S. pressure on Jerusalem to limit ties with Beijing. So the United States doesn't want Israel to expand its relations with China because of its current economic and trade warfare and also security warfare against China in order to limit the powers of China on an international level. So on the face, having China in Syria is not in and of itself a major concern for Israel, according to the author, but the economic or military improvements China could bring to Syria's military is a reason for concern. So this is, as we say in Arabic, the butter of the issue, right? This is the main point here. The economic or military improvements China could bring to Syria, this is a matter of concern. Israel doesn't want for the economy of Syria to be improved again and doesn't want for the Syrian army to regroup and rebuild itself, because the past years it has been hit hardly by lots of terrorist groups and also consistently by the Israeli forces. So Israel doesn't want for the Syrian army to recover and have advanced weaponry or technology that can repel the Israeli attacks on Syria. And this is what he mentions later in the article. Israeli defense sources told Breaking Defense, so told him basically, that the exact type of the communication systems to be supplied to Syria is not clear. So they don't know what type of communication systems are these, but they're speculating. So, but it is expected to be of a type that will fill current gaps in Syria's military communications network. So this communication equipment could not be even for the Syrian army. It could be for civil use, right? But they were speculating. They think maybe this technology could be used by the Syrian army for its communication network. And the sources worry this could be only the tip of the iceberg of Chinese assistance for Syria's effort to rebuild its armed forces. So they think this is only on the surface that this deal has happened, but maybe there are other secret deals behind the curtains. This is what Israel thinks. So he quotes someone. We have indications that Chinese experts visited in recent months some Syrian military installations that were damaged heavily during the civil war, one source said. So he doesn't mention who is this source. We believe that many facilities of the Syrian army will be rebuilt by the Chinese, who have the capability of bringing in thousands of workers to complete the work in the shortest time. So this source apparently is from a security apparatus or from the Israeli army. He also warned that the Chinese may try to sell the Syrians some of their defense systems, which could, how dare Syrians buy defense systems, right? Because this defense system will protect the Syrian skies from continuous Israeli attacks, which could complicate Israeli operations in Syria. Israel should have a free hand and bomb Syria continuously, and Syrian army shouldn't try to defend the skies of Syria, according to the Israeli narrative. So this source says the Russian-made systems used by the Syrians are almost useless. I don't know how they evaluate this, because Syria is using a very old S-200 and Panzer S-1 systems, and I would say 70% of the attempts by Syria to intercept the Israeli hostile objects, the missiles, the rockets, etc., were successful. Of course, they hit always. Like if you attack 10 or 12 or 20 missiles, some of them will hit their targets, right? And if we want to make a comparison and draw parallels, lots of times the Palestinian or the Lebanese factions, when they fire rockets on Israel, Israel cannot intercept all of them, and lots of them fell on Israeli cities or illegal settlements, right? So do we also say that the American or the Israeli Iron Dome are useless? They don't say this, but it is what it is. So analysts who talked with Breaking Defense agree that there are real reasons for concern in Israel over a greater Chinese investment in Syria. Quote, any type of relations between a world power like China and a country that is one of Israel's enemies is worrying. So even the Israelis agree that the current government of Syria is an enemy to Israel. And this is whoever said this is Dani Yatom. He is the former head of the Israeli Mossad intelligence agency. But if you ask these so-called anti-Assad activists, and they all, by the way, believe that somehow Assad is a secret ally for Israel, and there is a deal between them, and that his father, Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad, sold the Golan Heights to Israel in exchange for him to stay in power, something that there is no evidence for it at all. And even the Israelis say, guys, this is not true, come on. Syrians hurt us a lot, and they supplied deadly weapons to armed factions who fought against us, and especially in 2008 and 2006. So the Chinese, without any doubt, will perform a big programs in Syria, and Israel should make sure that this fact will not limit its freedom of action in Syria. Israel will not take any chance of hitting by mistake Chinese people that will be working in Syria as part of the reconstruction work. So Yatom pointed out that what may look like commercial work in Syria could be a cover for military or intelligence efforts. So as I mentioned, the Israelis are worried that they may not be able to continue their aerial bombardment of Syria in a free way, despite the fact that the Syrian army is repelling much of these attacks, but also Syria acquiring any advanced weaponry could stop these attacks, and Israel doesn't want this because they claim that Iran is sending weaponry to Syria and these weapons are going to Hezbollah. So the question here is, if this is true, why Israel isn't bombing these cargoes in Lebanon? Why they're bombing it in Syria? So this is another question mark for the Israelis. In any ways, they're worried that they cannot really wage attacks continuously in a free way without, I would say, a better defense against these attacks. The Chinese operations in many countries prove that there are always other aspects to what may look like a normal commercial action, the former Mossad head of Mossad said. Now, Mordechai Kedar, who is a senior expert on Middle East issues, believes China's presence will complicate the already chaotic efforts by Israel to conduct efforts in Syria, predicting, they call the attacks efforts. The attacks on Syria are efforts in Syria, predicting that in the not so far future, Israel will have to coordinate its attacks on Iranian-related targets in Syria, not only with Russia, but also with China. This is, by the way, very controversial, this statement. And lots of people believe in this, and I have no evidence for it, and I don't know if it's true or not. Some people say that Israel coordinates its attacks with Russia on Iranian targets in Syria. And some Syrian sources say this is not accurate. They say the agreement between Russia and Israel is an aerial agreement that bars or avoids any aerial accidents between the Air Force of Russia and the Air Force of Israel. But others say this is not correct. Israel tells the Russians when they're going to bomb Syria. But apparently, after a few bombings, Israel also said that they told the Russians just like a minute or two before the attack, because there was some Russian warplane or a cargo in the airspace, so that there would be no accident. I don't know if this is true or not, and I don't know, like, why would China, for example, supply Syria with technology, as they say, that may minimize or stop the Israeli attacks if the Chinese are gonna give a green light for the Israelis to bomb Syria? It doesn't make any sense for me. It's just a contradiction of what they say. Kedar added that China is the only country that currently has the huge sums of money needed to reconstruct Syria, and this is true. I mentioned this many times. Neither Iran nor Russia are able to reconstruct Syria. It's only China, and China also wants certain level of stability in Syria to reconstruct or weigh in more in the efforts for the reconstruction of Syria. So where have we been here? It's a non-Chinese policy to make big investments in countries that are facing economic problems. Through these investments, Beijing is getting control on the country that gets the Chinese money, and that is exactly what is going to happen in Syria. The US and Israel should be aware of that. This is also controversial because, in my observation, this is exactly what the Americans do, and they don't only search for countries who are suffering from economic hardships. They bring economic hardships into countries, and then they give a helping hand through the IMF and the World Bank by giving sums of money to these countries in exchange for political conditions, and these conditions are very harsh. You would be a slave and you will not be able to pay off your debt forever. The Chinese, in my understanding, they haven't done this yet. And when I say this, I say this in Syria. They haven't done this. They are helping Syria in some aspects, economically and financially and infrastructure, and they haven't posed any political conditions, and the Chinese also say we have no interest in imposing any political conditions, because Syria in all cases is the policies is in harmony with the Chinese and with the Russians, right? So you don't need to impose other political conditions. Galia Lavi, a senior researcher in the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies, noted that Beijing is showing the Syrians that they care about their future and may go even deeper into the huge reconstruction program of this ruined country. I mean, how dare the Chinese care about the Syrian people? Why the Americans do not care about the Syrian people? Why do they impose sanctions? Why do they occupy their oil fields? Why do they burn their wheat? Let them show some goodwill. Maybe the Syrians forgive them. Why aren't the Americans doing that? Why aren't the Europeans doing that? I mean, you closed all doors in front of Syria to get any basic necessities needed for reconstruction, and even food and medicine. And what do you expect Syria to go where to get its basic necessities? I don't really understand the logic here. So why would China invest heavily in Syria? Israeli defense sources contacted by Breaking Defense. So you see, as I mentioned, he represents the official line of Israel. They pointed out that China has been trying to establish a navy presence in the Mediterranean for years. Beijing at first cooperated with Russia in relation to this requested presence, but according to Israeli defense sources in recent years, Beijing has been seeking ways to be able to operate in the Mediterranean alone, having favors to call in with Damascus would seem the easiest way to gain access to the desired waters. Here they are again something very important. The so-called experts on Syria, those who work for state-funded think tanks, those who are called themselves experts, the journalists, etc., from the mainstream, right? They always claim that Syria has become a satellite state for Russia or a satellite state for Iran, and Syria cannot take its decisions, it lost its sovereignty, etc., etc. And if this is true, why would the Chinese talk to the Syrian government? They can talk to Iranians. Let them go and talk to the Russians. So, of course, Russia can facilitate this, but the final decision is in the hands of the Syrian government. And there are lots of incidents that the Russians gave some advices or suggested some reforms, constitutional reforms to Syria, and the Syrians refused it because for them, they know better from their perspective what Syria needs and what type of reform should be presented to Syria, right? Another potential reason identified in an in-depth report from the Operations of Policy Center is concerns over Chinese Uyghur fighters that have gone to Syria and who could potentially return home with combat experience and armaments to cause problems for the People's Republic of China. This is true. The Chinese should be worried. There are at least 5,000 heavily armed Uyghurs in Syria, in addition to their kids and wives, and their kids are getting training too, like kids in their 10, 12 years old, even younger. And these people are ideologically radicalized, and they are very good fighters, very, very good fighters. So the Chinese should be concerned about the Uyghurs. But how to solve this if this area is occupied by Al-Qaeda, which is in Idlib, and also the Turks are protecting these terrorists, right? So if China wants to resolve this, they have to go to the Turks. The Syrians cannot help the Chinese in this regard. But as the report points out, there is also long-standing relations between Syria and China prior to the civil war. The authors note that China helped supply Damascus with support for its ballistic missiles program, as well as potentially having a role in the creation of Syria's chemical weapon. This is completely lie. This is a big fat lie. Chinese had no role in the Syrian chemical weapons program that started, I think, in the 70s or early 80s. Has no at all a role in this. This is just trying to say, like, look, China had a bad role in the past, so they could also have a bad role now. They're trying to foil this agreement between Syria and China. The Chinese maybe helped Syria on a defense level in the missiles, etc., but they had no role at all in the creation of chemical weapons program. And before I made this video, I did some research, and I didn't find at all any Chinese role in the Syrian chemical weapons program that was created by Hafez al-Assad, I think late 70s, to counter the Israeli nuclear program. And it was a deterrence weapon by the Syrians, and they destroyed it. I think in 2013, in 2014, by the OPCW and the American warships in the Mediterranean. Anyways, Beijing's support of Damascus continued well after Bashar al-Assad rose to power in 2000. In 2002, China proposed building a production center for Scud missiles in Syria. I have no at all clue about this. I don't know where do they bring this information. It continued to rank among the top 5 weapon suppliers to Syria between 2006 and 2008. And according also to some information I know from reliable sources in Syria, even the deals that Syria made with Chinese before the war for some weapon technologies, the Chinese didn't supply Syrians with these weapons when the war started. The report states, I think that since 2000, China sold 76 million worth of trackable arms to Syria, with more likely having moved under the radar. And the report adds, Chinese military advisors are reportedly already in Syria to train their Syrian counterparts on a wide range of weapons purchased from China, including rocket launchers, machine guns, and sniper rifles. A regime source, so they also have a regime source. I don't know who's this regime source talking to Israeli so-called expert and Israeli newspaper, because he would be really in a big trouble. The increased Sino-Syrian cooperation in recent times by stating there are weapons and technical supplies. The Chinese embassy's security delegation has been expanded, suggesting preparations for a wider role, and the Chinese team of experts had arrived in Damascus military airport. I mean, he's either making up these statements from a regime source, or whoever is this, if he's really a regime source, he should be in a really big trouble if they know who the identity of this person. So they say this website reached out to the Chinese embassy in Tel Aviv, and they didn't comment on this issue. So what do you think about this report? It's really interesting, in my opinion. This deal between Syria and China could be just for civil use, this communication equipment. And the Israelis are trying to distort this deal and say that it's military because they want to stop the reconstruction of Syria. Or this equipment could be used also in military purposes. I'm not sure about it. But in all cases, what do you think about the analysis of this report? Do you think the Chinese will help Syria to rebuild its army, to be capable of effectively repelling the Israeli attacks, or this is just about the civil use? Let me know your opinion in the comments below. It's really important to read and go through your comments. And yes, that's it. I've been your host, Kerak Almasyan of Syriana Analysis. If you're new, please consider subscribing and hit the like button. It's free, guys. Really, it helps me. And also, if you want to support my work, all the links are in the description below. You can become a patron. You can be a premium member on YouTube, or you can also, there is this super like, something new, a new tool on YouTube. You can click and support me. It's very important for me to have the financial means to continue and bring to you commentaries about Syria, Ukraine, Middle East, Far East Asia, etc. And soon there will be a new video posted on Syriana Analysis. So stay tuned. See you next time.